In this video, we're going to look at the Mometta II, a small fixed lens 35mm rangefinder. There's not a whole lot of information out there on the internet about this camera, so let's just take a quick look at it and see what we can come up with. All right, as I mentioned, this is a fixed lens camera. That is, the lens is not removable. There's very little information about this camera on the internet. And probably because Hungary was never the center of photography. That doesn't mean that it didn't make cameras. It just means that it just didn't produce that many, probably outside of Hungary and the other Soviet bloc nations. In fact, most of these, I believe, are going to come either from Hungary or from one of the former Soviet bloc countries. The producer of this camera was MOM, not Mom, but I'm sure that's an acronym for a Hungarian manufacturer. So this carries a 3.5 50mm lens. This is a Tessar type lens, so it's going to be 4 elements in 3 groups. Everything here is marked for the European market. That is, all distances are in meters. This has a coupled rangefinder, so here's your two windows. This is the actual rangefinder window, and this is your viewfinder, with a superimposed rangefinder patch. This has a small focusing lever rather than a tab, and it works pretty well. There's a small depth of field scale printed above the lens. There is no self-timer with this camera. I believe these 4 screws very likely hold the lens to onto the body. You'll notice that it has this sort of this reverse trapezoidal shape to the body, where the body actually curves inward in the back. I think some of the Exacta cameras had a similar type shape. On the top of the camera, we have your frame counter. This is your shutter release and also your rewind switch. Here's your small shutter speed dial. And you have a very limited range of speeds. Your speed selections include 25, 50, 100, 200, and 500. There's a small accessory shoe, however, it's not a hot shoe, and I don't believe it will take a standard flash. Well, let's try. Oh, yes, it will. Well, not really. Yeah, as you can see, the flash sort of hangs off the back of the camera. Plus, there's no synchronization. Screw or post right here. There's also no synchronization port on the lens or anywhere on the body. So this would be used for something else, possibly maybe a sports finder or some type of viewfinder with a close-up lens. Not entirely sure. Here we have the name of the camera, Mometta II, and here we have the manufacturer's logo. Notice that underneath the 3 letters MOM, you have a small outline of a lens element, and I've seen that used with other camera makers. There was a Mometta. I don't think they called the Mometta I. It was just Mometta. I can't really recall what that looked like. There were successor models to this camera, the Mometta III and the Mometta Junior. I believe the 3 and the Junior had interchangeable lenses, but the Junior did not have a rangefinder, which always limits the camera's usefulness as a photographic tool. On the back, it's fairly simple, just your eyepiece, and on the bottom, you have a single key that unlocks the back. You have 2 tripod screws, so that is a bit different. And obviously not in the center of the lens, not in the center of the camera or in alignment with the center of the lens. Rather, they're on either side, so I guess you have a choice depending on how you want to use it. This camera appears to have been used now and then on a tripod, because you can see how some of the finish has been worn away by attaching it to a tripod. This camera also has an inscription. I have no idea what it says. If somebody from Hungary if somebody knows Hungarian and would like to translate, I'm all up for it. So let's open this camera. Flip this up. turn it, it's just a quarter turn counterclockwise, and the back slides off. There we are. Now, here's a surprise. This is a cloth focal plane shutter. And why do I say that's a bit of a surprise? Because generally most East German cameras carried a leaf shutter. Not all, but many of them. So that is a bit of a surprise. So advancing the film also tensions the shutter. And most cameras are similar to that. Because you do have a focal plane shutter in here, it does add a bit of complexity to the mechanism in here. Loading the film is slightly more challenging, and that's simply because of how this is set up. So you can see that you don't drop your roll of film in, you have to slide it in. Then you bring your leader around, then you have to insert it into a very tiny slot, which you can now see. See, so loading film is somewhat, loading film in this camera. Do it this way. So loading film into this camera is somewhat of an, well, it's more complicated than most cameras. Not as complicated as some, including those screw mount Leicas. Some of the gears for the film advance are exposed, so that's also generally not desirable. With the back removed from the camera, let's take a look at a couple things. It sort of has a uniquely shaped oval pressure plate. And it just has a slight amount of movement, but probably enough to keep the film flat. And of course, the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against these rails, so that when you take your photograph, it will record as sharp a photo as possible. That is always incumbent, of course, that the lens taking the photograph be able to record a sharp image. One thing that's slightly different with the Mometta II is the size of the photograph. Normally, a 35 millimeter full frame negative is going to be 24 by 36 millimeters. In this case, it's 24 by 32 millimeters. And you can see how that is the case right here. So that in itself is different, and that also means that you're going to get maybe one extra shot on a roll 35 millimeter. I don't think it really makes a difference, but it is something to keep in mind. The fact that it's not a standard 35 millimeter frame always makes me wonder, the thinking that went into coming up with that image size. And it could be perhaps that the lens image circle wasn't large enough to actually fully cover 35 millimeter, a full 36 millimeter frame. I don't know. I really don't know. It's just one of those odd things. As they say, it is what it is. So the back slides on. It doesn't drop. Well, it can drop into place, but you don't have to start it way back here. You can just sort of drop it in here, push these two halves together. Here we are. Turn that key, fold it down, and it locks into place. So you'll notice two designations, a Z and then an I. Presumably these stand for Hungarian words. This would be closed, of course. This would be open. I seem to recall using this camera. I don't recall what the photos were like. I thought I used this camera, but it's been probably, I don't know, 15 or 16 years since I purchased it. So possibly I did, possibly I didn't. In any case, I have no idea where the negatives are if I did use the camera. It's a pleasant camera to use. You'll see. Oh, so let's mention real quickly. After I mentioned the fact that you have your distance scale and your depth of field scale, you also have your aperture settings right here. And they run from f3.5, the widest setting, to f16 at the smallest setting. And that's fairly typical. It's somewhat tiny to use, so the fact that it's so tiny sometimes makes it a little bit difficult to try to focus because of the fact that, you're sort of competing for space with your hands, with your fingers. As you hold the camera, you also have your finger over here. to be able to push and pull that focusing lever through the focusing range. The one unusual thing is the placement of the shutter release. So as you hold the camera, you almost have to pull your finger back a bit. And some of the Leicas, some of those early screw mount Leicas were a bit weird like that, where you had to, instead of your finger just naturally, resting on the shutter release, you had to find the shutter and then, like I said, pull your finger back a little bit in order to release the shutter. Not a terrible arrangement, but it is somewhat unusual. When you rewind the film, you take this little lever, push it all the way to the right. Then you can pull up on this part of the rewind knob and rewind your film. Now remember, this is knob rewind. Actually, it's knob wind and knob rewind. So the fact that it's both knob wind and knob rewind means that it just takes a bit more time when using this camera. Once again, that's not always a bad thing, because I think everything you do in photography should be a deliberative act. I don't know how many models this sold. Probably not a whole lot, because this isn't a camera that is discussed often. So this is a post-war camera, and how do I know that? It's because the fact that it has a coated lens. You can see the blue reflection in the lens, and that would indicate that it's a coated lens. This particular camera was in decent shape. The chrome portions of the body were soiled, but they weren't too dirty. And the rub marks, there's a few rub marks here and there, but nothing terrible. This camera had no dents or dings on the body, and the covering itself was intact. I didn't have to do anything to it. There are no ugly bumps underneath it, like some other cameras. And, it just needed some routine service. Because, as I mentioned, this camera was made, I believe, in the 1950s. So at this point in 2024, that makes it 70 plus years old. Or roughly 70 years old. The viewfinder in this camera is very plain. It has no frame lines and obviously no parallax marks. In the center of the viewfinder is a small rectangular rangefinder patch. It's easy enough to use, and I really didn't have a problem focusing on it in a variety of lighting situations. The presence of a rangefinder patch in this camera sets it apart from its East German counterparts in that it has a rangefinder patch. As you know, East Germany didn't make a lot of rangefinders with a rangefinder patch. They generally used the rangefinder with the split image. It's not to say that there were no traditional rangefinders, just that there were very few. Although it's never been explained, I think it probably had to do with the fact that beam splitting mirrors probably were reserved for military use. However, Hungary was not East Germany, and not all Soviet bloc countries were like, as history has shown. Keep in mind that this is not a professional level camera. It was simply a camera made for the amateur market, probably the advanced amateur market. This particular manufacturer made a couple of cameras, and some believe that the first single lens reflex 35mm camera, with eye level viewing, came from this camera maker. According to Wikipedia, the first eye level SLR viewfinder was patented in Hungary in 1943. However, rather than use a pentaprism, it used a series of mirrors to accomplish an erect, laterally correct image in the viewfinder. I've seen these cameras turn up now and then, and usually for quite a handsome sum. And that would have been back in the early 2000s. I haven't looked for one in some time. I don't see any on sale now. My guess is they're probably in the thousands of dollars when they do appear, and it's probably going to be fairly infrequent when you do see these show up on the used market. So you can tell by my hands that this is a smaller-ish camera. It's not real small, but I would say that it leans toward the smaller size. So let's take a look and see what this camera weighs. Okay, so this camera weighs just over a pound. I think we could say that's 1 pound, 2 ounces. I was thinking that it might be under a pound, but I was wrong about that. Regardless, this is not a heavyweight camera. And I think 1 pound, 2 ounces is still a fairly light camera. I believe this camera came with a case, but I don't have it. And if you notice, this camera has no strap lugs at all. So if you do carry it, your best bet is to probably keep it in a bag most of the time, and then when you're ready to shoot, you could then pull it out of the bag and shoot, or you could attach one of those hand straps that would then slot into your tripod socket here. Keep in mind that the tripod socket is on the end, not in the center, so I think it probably should be workable. And so that brings us to the end of this video. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have a question or you'd like to see me talk about another camera in the future, let me know in the comments below or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And see you on the next video.